In the harsh winter of 1747, in the quiet village of Zawarki, Poland, a peculiar and disturbing phenomenon began to unfold. Jacob, a boy of 12, started walking backward, at first a minor oddity, a childish quirk that drew laughter and teasing from neighbors. But the behavior quickly intensified, becoming an all-consuming compulsion. He walked backward to school, backward in the marketplace, backward while performing household chores, even backward while eating. His parents, initially amused, grew increasingly concerned as his backward steps seemed impervious to correction or reason. Scholars who later studied Jacob noted the obsessive, relentless nature of his motion, suggesting a psychological compulsion so extreme that it defied conventional understanding. But the mystery of Jacob extended beyond mere psychology. Villagers whispered of shadows that twisted unnaturally as he passed, of sudden chills and whispers in empty streets, of farm animals striking out violently without provocation whenever he neared. One local elder claimed to have seen their reflection of Jacob walking backward in a frozen pond. Yet the reflection moved forward, as though reality itself resisted his steps. Priests debated the significance. Some called it a sign of sin, an inversion of divine order, occult reversing the flow of time with every backward stride. Others offered secular interpretations, grief, trauma, or an unknown mental disorder amplified by isolation, poverty, and the pervasive superstitions of a small village. Jacob's backward walking became a lens through which the villagers confronted their own fears. Children avoided him, whispering that he carried a curse. Merchants crossed the street, murmuring that misfortune followed him. Even his family reported strange occurrences in their home. Objects moved inexplicably, floors creaked though no one was present, and at night, faint, sorrowful cries seemed to echo through the cold Polish wind. Some suggested that Jacob was not merely walking backward, but dragging time itself behind him, reversing events too subtle to notice, yet felt in the uneasy silence that hung over Zawiercie. As weeks turned to months, Jacob's compulsion did not wane. Neighbors began documenting his steps, sketching his daily routes, and timing his backward journeys. Scholars centuries later would speculate that he may have been the subject of extreme obsessive-compulsive disorder, a neurological anomaly, or even a form of psychogenic trauma, yet none could fully explain the intensity, nor the accompanying phenomena. Were the shadows, whispers, and animal reactions coincidental, products of superstition and fear magnified by collective anxiety? Or were they evidence of something beyond human comprehension, a subtle interaction between Theboy and forces unseen? Tonight, we revisit Jacob's story, a tale where childhood innocence collides with obsession, where superstition and fear intertwine with the inexplicable, and where human understanding strag against phenomena that resist explanation. Centuries later, his backward steps remain a symbol of unresolved mystery, challenging historians, psychologists, and philosophers alike. Was Jacob a boy possessed, a mind broken by trauma, or a conduit for forces humanity cannot name? As we step carefully through history and testimony, the question persists: what truly compelled Jacob to walk backward until the very end of his days, leaving a trail of questions that echoes still through Zawiercie's frozen streets? Jacob was born in 1737 in the small Polish village of Zawiercie, a settlement tucked between rolling hills and dense forests, where winters could freeze the bones of the unwary and summers brought swarms of insects that tormented the livestock. His family lived on the margins of subsistence, in a small wooden cottage whose walls bore the scent of smoke and pine sap. His father, a simple farmer, labored from dawn to dusk, while his mother tended the household and the small patch of vegetables that sustained them through long, unforgiving winters. Parish records described Jacob's early childhood as seemingly ordinary. He walked, talked, and laughed with other children, and he displayed an unusual attentiveness to the natural world. He would linger over the wayside light, pierce the canopy of trees, fascinated by the patterns of leaves and shadows. Birds, small animals, and even insects seemed to draw his attention in a way that villagers found unsettling. Some whispered that he possessed a peculiar sensitivity, as though he could feel the world's hidden pulse, sensing energies invisible to ordinary men. Even as a toddler, Jacob exhibited behaviors that drew both admiration and unease. He was quick to comfort crying siblings or neighbors, yet prone to intense fits of agitation when routines were broken. His father, a man of simple faith, interpreted this alternately as evidence of innate virtue and as a sign that the boy was touched by forces beyond human understanding. Jacob's mother, a devout woman, prayed constantly for her son, and would often wake in the night to find him kneeling by the hearth, whispering prayers in a rhythm that seemed to echo the cadence of the wind through the forest. To outsiders, such acts appeared harmless, even charming, yet for villagers steeped in superstition, these moments carried a subtle hint of otherworldliness. They noticed the way shadows seemed to stretch toward him, the way animals would freeze in his presence, and there were incidents where he would stare at empty corners of the room with an intensity that unsettled even the most stoic elders. By the age of 5, Jacob developed a peculiar compulsion. He began arranging objects with obsessive precision, aligning wooden toys, stones, and household implements with a meticulous care that defied explanation. If a single item were out of place, he would become irritable, often retreating to a corner to rock back and forth, murmuring to himself in a language that sounded both familiar and cryptic. Neighbors described seeing him step backward along paths he had walked, sometimes retracing his own footprints as though attempting to undo time itself. Some scholars suggest these behaviors were early manifestations of obsessive-impulsive tendencies, magnified by an environment that offered little distraction from his inner world. Others, steeped in folklore, believed Jacob was marked by a curse, perhaps the lingering shadow of a sin committed by an ancestor, or a spirit that had taken interest in the boy. Stories circulated of his grandfather, a man reputed to have dabbled in charms and whispered incantations, who had died under mysterious circumstances. Villagers speculated that the boy inherited not only sensitivity, but also the consequences of meddling with unseen forces, and they watched him with a mixture of pity and dread. Jacob's early schooling, limited as it was, further revealed the complexities of his nature. He displayed remarkable intelligence for his age, absorbing lessons in reading, writing, and arithmetic with unusual speed. His handwriting, preserved in fragmentary parish ledgers, is precise, angular, almost unnaturally neat. Teachers noted his capacity for empathy, recounting how he would comfort peers who were punished or bullied. Yet they also recorded episodes in which Jacob would suddenly refuse to engage with the world, turning his back to the classroom for hours, his gaze fixed on the open window or the floor beneath his feet. Local historians have interpreted this as a combination of trauma and a developing psychotic disorder, though at the time it was often described in terms of superstition. Some villagers swore that when he walked backward along the narrow streets of Zaverki, the wind would pick up and animals would cry out in alarm, as though the village itself recognized the inversion of the natural order. The boy's family life was not without hardship. His elder brother, Micha, died at age 7 after a sudden illness, an event that left Jacob profoundly affected. Witnesses described him wandering the forests for hours, murmuring the names of the dead and tracing patterns in the soil with his fingers. Parish records from the period note that he would sometimes refuse to eat, standing with his back to the table, repeating prayers in reverse or speaking in a manner that adults could not understand. This combination of grief, compulsion, and intense empathy may have recreated the conditions for the behaviors that would later define his adolescence. Folk traditions painted him in darker terms. The boy was cursed to walk against the flow of life, to undo what others could not, a living symbol of the village's sins and misfortunes. Some priests argued that he was a vessel for divine punishment, while others whispered that he had made a pact with forces no human should confront. Jacob's adolescence intensified duality of his existence. While the village elders marveled at his intelligence and compassion, they also feared his unpredictable obsessions. He would often perform elaborate rituals near streams, arranging stones and sticks in intricate patterns, muttering prayers backward, and leaving offerings of bread and water. Some believed these actions protected the village from unseen evils, while others suspected they summoned them. Witnesses reported that livestock refused to drink from certain water troughs when Jacob approached, and shadows in homes seemed to move independently when he was present. Scholars examining these accounts note that many of these behaviors can be interpreted through the lens of trauma, anxiety, and compulsive disorders, yet the intensity and duration of the phenomena defy simple explanation. The psychological and mystical aspects of Jacob's early life converged most sharply during the winter of 1747. Reports indicate that he began walking backward obsessively, initially in private, then in public spaces. He refused to eat facing forward, retraced his steps along paths, and spoke sentences in reverse order. Neighbors described a palpable tension in the air, as though the village itself recoiled from the inversion of normality. Shadows clung unnaturally to walls, fires flickered in strange patterns, and whispers seemed to rise from empty streets. Priests debated whether Jacob's behavior was a moral or spiritual failing, a reflection of sin or a test of faith. Psychologists, interpreting these events retrospectively, consider them early manifestations of extreme obsessive-compulsive disorder, compounded by grief, isolation, and the rigid structures of 18th-century village life. Even as adults, the villagers continued to interpret Jacob's early behaviors through the lens of superstition. Tales emerged that he could influence weather patterns, that storms seemed to follow his backward steps, and that his presence could cause animals to panic without provocation. Some whispered that he had glimpsed realms beyond human perception, domains where time itself could be traversed in reverse. Folklorists highlight parallels with European legends of children marked by otherworldly forces, while historians note the striking alignment between his documented behaviors and known psychological disorders. The duality is essential. Jacob was at once a sensitive, intelligent child with extraordinary empathy and a figure feared, misunderstood, and interpreted as an agent of darker forces. By the end of his childhood, Jacob had become a figure of fascination and fear. He was described in parish records, letters, and local folklore as a boy whose innocence was inseparable from his obsession, whose compassion was shadowed by compulsion, and whose life would become the nexus of psychological study, superstition, and enduring mystery. This foundation rooted in poverty, trauma, intelligence, and supernatural spinal sets the stage for the unfolding events of his adolescence and early adulthood, where the boundaries between reality, mental illness, and folklore blur, leaving a question that has haunted historians and psychologists alike. Was Jacob merely a boy with a rare psychological condition, or had he become something more, a vessel through which the village's fears and the unknowable forces of the world found expression? Jacob's backward walking began quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the winter of 1747, when he was 10 years old. His schoolteacher, a middle-aged man named Pyotr Kowalski, first noticed the oddity during morning lessons. Jakub would enter the classroom, turn his back toward the door, and step backward across the floor to reach his desk. Initially, Kowalski laughed, assuming it was a child's harmless prank, a display of mischievousness and to amuse peers. The boy's friends followed suit with laughter, clapping and cheering as Jacob executed this peculiar ritual. Yet within weeks, the behavior escalated. He began performing ordinary tasks entirely in reverse, pouring water backward from a cup into a pitcher, undoing the threads of his clothing to fold them while wearing them, walking backward along the cobblestone streets of Zavirki to fetch wood or water. By the time winter fully settled over the village, Jacob had transformed what might have been playful mimicry into a ritualized, obsessive practice that dominated every aspect of his daily life. Villagers quickly became alarmed. To them, the child's backward steps violated natural order. They noted that his presence seemed to alter the flow of time itself, or at least to bend perception. Those who observed him reported physical symptoms, dizziness, vertigo, and nausea that lasted hours after witnessing his movements. Some claimed that the air around Jacob carried a peculiar chill, an intangible sense of wrongness that caused animals to cower and children to cry. Farmers passing by recounted how livestock would stampede when Jacob approached the barn, seemingly licensing a shift in the natural rhythm of the world. Scholars who have later analyzed these accounts suggest that observers' reactions could have been psychosomatic, a collective anxiety provoked by the boy's unusual actions, but the frequency and consistency of reports suggest more than mere suggestion. Whether understood as psychological contagion or a hint of something unexplainable, the reactions of the villagers illustrate the profound effect Jacob's behavior had on his environment. Religious interpretations quickly emerged. Priests visiting the village claimed that Jacob's backward walking was a sign of spiritual imbalance, a visible marker often manifesting in physical form. Father Andrei Novak, a local cleric, admonished the boy publicly, urging him to repent and walk in accordance with the path ordained by God. Villagers, largely devout and fearful of divine punishment, supported this interpretation. Some families reported that their children fell ill or crops failed after witnessing Jacob's movements, reinforcing the belief that his actions carried cosmic significance. Superstitions accompanied the fear. Elders spoke of previous generations cursed to walk against the flow of time. Condemned reversed the actions of the living in payment for ancestral sins. Folklorists examining Zauberki later lighted the prevalence of similar tales in rural Poland children whose behaviors were interpreted as signs of spiritual or supernatural influence, whose obsessions were feared as manifestations of forces beyond human comprehension. Attempts to intervene were numerous but largely ineffective. Kowalski tried to encourage Akuto move forward during lessons, gently guiding him toward the blackboard or redirecting his path along Fest Street. Family members implored him to resume normal behavior, yet the boy resisted, often responding with tears, agitation, and the repetition of backward steps with even greater intensity. Scholars later hypothesized that this resistance stemmed from an early psychological compulsion, possibly exacerbated by trauma, grief, or hereditary tendencies. Villagers, however, interpreted it as defiance against natural law, or even as evidence of possession. Jacob's mother, torn between love and fear, sometimes locked him in the house for hours, hoping confinement would halt the backward movements, only to find that he would spend the time pacing in reverse, tracing patterns along the floorboards and mumbling prayers that mirrored the cadence of his steps. Eyewitness accounts detail the escalating peculiarity of Jacob's behavior. One neighbor, Katarzyna Lewandowska, recounted seeing him walk backward through a snowstorm, leaving footprints that seemed to defy the normal rules of tracking. "I followed them," she wrote in a fragmentary diary later preserved in parish archives, "and yet the last step appeared in the middle of the frozen river. It was as though he had crossed the world invisible to my eyes." Others reported that shadows bent unnaturally around him, elongating and contracting in ways inconsistent with sunlight or lantern light. Children who attempted to mimic his movements became frightened, claiming they heard voices whispering in empty streets and felt the chill of unseen hands along their backs. These testimonies, recorded in parish and court documents, suggest that Jacob's backward walking was not merely an individual compulsion, but an event that reverberated outward, affecting both the physical and psychological environment of Zauberki. Psychological explanations, when considered retrospectively, point to several possibilities. Modern scholars propose that Jacob exhibited extreme obsessive-compulsive behavior, potentially triggered by grief over the death of his elder brother Misha, early childhood trauma, or hereditary predispositions to anxiety and compulsion. His backward walking could have been a mechanism to assert control in a world perceived as chaotic, a ritual that allowed him to navigate grief and fear by imposing order in reverse. However, such theories fail to account fully for the reported environmental effects, the vertigo of observers, the panicked animals, and the eerie atmospheric anomalies which blur the line between psychological phenomenon and something approaching the paranormal. As the months progressed, the backward walking became totalizing. Jacob ceased forward movement entirely, performing daily routines, eating, writing, even responding to visitors while retreating from the present. His body seemed to move against gravity and time, each step a deliberate act of inversion. Villagers described a palpable tension in the air whenever he passed, a sense of wrongness that could not be explained by simple habit. Scholars examining these behaviors emphasize that while compulsions can dominate daily life, Jacob's actions extended beyond the individual into the social and environmental sphere, creating a collective fear that permeated the village. Priestly intervention intensified during this period. Multiple clergy members attempted exorcism, ritual blessing, and moral instruction. Father Novak insisted Jacob's behavior was a sign of demonic influence, invoking prayers and holy water in attempts to reverse the boy's motion and align him with divine order. Each effort, however, seemed only to deepen the compulsion. Observers reported that Jacob's backward walking accelerated when confronted by authority, suggesting a psychological inter-effect. The pressure to conform to normative behavior intensified the ritualized steps, creating a feedback loop that entrenched the obsession further. By the end of the first year, Jacob's backward walking had transformed from a peculiar quirk to a pervasive phenomenon that defined his identity within the village. Scholars interpreting the case centuries later emphasized the interplay of trauma, compulsion, and environment. A boy uniquely sensitive, grieving, and compelled by unknown forces, whose actions provoked reactions that amplified fear, superstition, and fascination. Folklorists highlight the symbolic resonance, a child moving backward through life, retracing steps, defying natural order, and casting a reflection of collective anxiety back upon his community. Whether understood as a psychological disorder, a supernatural affliction, or a convergence of both, Jacob's first backward steps mark the beginning of a phenomenon that would grow increasingly intense, terrifying, and historically enigmatic. Jacob's strange and relentless backward walking, which began in 1747, became a subject of fascination, fear, and speculation both during his life and for centuries afterward. From the first observers in the small Polish village of Zwawerki to modern scholars poring over historical accounts, two dominant frameworks have emerged, scientific and supernatural. The tension between these interpretations illuminates not only the mystery of Jacob himself, but also the ways humans attempt to make sense of behaviors that defy conventional endurance. On one hand, rationalists point to neurological or psychological conditions, suggesting that a combination of hereditary predisposition, early trauma, and environmental stressors created a compulsion beyond his control. Medical historians and psychiatrists propose diagnoses such as obsessive-compulsive disorder, conversion disorder, or a rare form of motor tic, each capable of producing ritualized movements, repetitive behaviors, and social withdrawal. These explanations frame Jacob as a profoundly ill but fundamentally human boy, whose body and mind responded to unseen pressures through backward motion. Ergotism has also been suggested as a contributing factor. In 18th century rural Poland, contaminated rye bread carrying the fungus Claviceps purpurea was a common hazard, causing hallucinations, seizures, and tremors. Contemporary reports of Jacob describe episodes of confusion, trembling limbs, and intense focus on repetitive emotion symptoms that could align with mild ergot poisoning or other forms of toxic exposure. Likewise, malnutrition, common in impoverished villages, may have exacerbated neurological vulnerabilities. These physiological explanations, however, do not fully account for the longevity or specificity of Jacob's behavior, whereas ergotism-induced symptoms are typically episodic or acute. Jacob maintained his backward walking for months, if not years, without periods of normal gait, indicating a more complex, perhaps psychosomatic component intertwined with environmental reinforcement. Psychologists studying the case retrospectively examine the role of social feedback and isolation in amplifying compulsive behavior. Jacob's actions provoked anxiety and fear among villagers, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. He became both the focus of attention and the subject of ostracism. Authority figures, teachers, parents, priests, attempted to correct or punish him, which often resulted in greater repetition of the behavior. Children imitated him in fear or play, while adults avoided or acted with alarm, magnifying his presence as a symbol of disruption. In modern terms, this can be understood as a form of social reinforcement. The boy's compulsions were maintained and intensified by the reactions of those around him. Isolation and heightened attention can exacerbate obsessive-compulsive symptoms, and Jacob's experience illustrates this phenomenon vividly, demonstrating the complex interplay of individual pathology and communal influence. Yet rationalist explanations struggle to account for aspects of the historical record that veer into the uncanny. Villagers reported shadows moving against the light, livestock panicking when Jacob approached, and an unnatural chill that accompanied his movements. Some witnesses claimed to hear whispers in empty streets or to see fleeting figures trailing his path. While these phenomena could be attributed to suggestibility, confirmation bias, or psychosomatic reactions, they were remarkably consistent across multiple independent observers, recorded in diaries, parish logs, and letters. Skeptics argue that collective fear can produce hallucinations or exaggerated memory, but the persistence and specificity of these accounts suggest a cultural and psychological environment primed to interpret ambiguity as supernatural intervention. Priests and local clergy offered an alternative lens, rooted in spiritual and moral frameworks. Father Andrei Novak, who admonished Jacob repeatedly, wrote of the boy as marked by sin or by forces unseen, suggesting that walking backward was a visible manifestation of inner corruption or divine warning. Villagers were steeped in folklore regarding reversed children, individuals whose actions contradicted natural order, often believed to be cursed, possessed, or agents of malevolent spirits. According to these traditions, walking backward disrupted the flow of time and angered protective forces, inviting misfortune upon the observer and community. When combined with stories of prior children in the region exhibiting similar behaviors and dying young or disappearing, Jacob's actions were interpreted as part of a recurring pattern, reinforcing the notion of supernatural causation. Folklorists examining the case highlight the intersection of cultural belief and behavior. In Zavirki, superstition and religious observance were tightly intertwined. Deviation from established norms was often coded as moral or spiritual transgression. Walking backward was not merely peculiar, it symbolically reversed expected order of life and society. To villagers, this was a tangible threat. Their moral and spiritual universe was being subverted in real time by the boy's movement. This interpretation affected how adults responded, influencing the strategies employed to correct Jacob and shaping the narrative preserved for posterity. Scholars argue that such feedback loops can embed the supernatural explanation into communal memory, creating enduring stories that resist purely scientific interpretation. The contrast between science and superstition in Jacob's story illustrates a broader tension between rational understanding and the need to assign moral or spiritual meaning to unexplained events. While medical theory provides compelling explanations for neurological, psychological, or toxic factors contributing to obsessive behavior, it fails to fully account for the societal, Environmental and cultural impact of the phenomenon. Likewise, spiritual and folkloric interpretation start the communal fear and symbolic weight of Jacob's backward steps, but offer little insight into the physiological or psychological mechanisms at play. Each lens provides partial understanding. Science situates the event within human biology and behavior, while superstition situates it within cultural, moral, and cosmic frameworks. Neither resolves the mystery entirely, leaving an enduring ambiguity at the heart of Jacob's life and legend. Later accounts by traveling scholars and historians reinforce this duality. Some documented precise measurements of Jacob's gait and timing, noting consistency and deliberate pacing that suggested conscious control beyond typical compulsive behavior. Others recorded villagers' testimony describing phenomena that seemed physically impossible, such as footprints appearing to vanish mid-path or the sensation of backward motion spreading to nearby children who never touched him. The persistence of such accounts across decades demonstrates the lasting psychological and cultural impact of Jacob's backward walking, cementing him as both a medical curiosity and a folkloric emblem of disorder in the natural and spiritual order. Jacob's case, then, resides at the intersection of science and superstition. The neurological, psychological, and toxicological offer frameworks grounded in observation and evidence, yet they cannot fully explain the pervasive fix his behavior had on community perception, social interactions, and environmental anecdotes. Conversely, supernatural interpretations account for the intensity and social consequences, but cannot satisfactorily address the physiological and psychological dimensions. In this tension, the narrative of Jacob's backward walk engenders a phenomenon simultaneously human and inexplicable, rational and uncanny, scientific and mystical. The historical documentation, combined with folklore and retrospective analysis, invites reflection on the limitations of human understanding. Jacob's story exemplifies how extreme behavior, social reinforcement, and cultural interpretation converge, producing events that transcend simple explanation. The boy's backward walking becomes a prism through which we examine the boundary between pathology and possession, between individual compulsion and communal reaction, between fear of the unknown and attempts at rational understanding. Scholars continue to debate whether Jacob was a case study in neuropsychiatric disorder, an agent of supernatural forces, or a unique intersection of both. The intensity, duration, and societal impact of Jacob's behavior remain remarkable. By juxtaposing medical and folkloric explanations, we see how multiple realities can coexist: the empirical and the mystical, the observable and the symbolic. The boy's backward walking was not merely a personal affliction. It was a catalyst for collective anxiety, spiritual reflection, and cultural narrative. In examining Jacob through these dual lenses, we confront the enduring challenge of interpreting phenomena that straddle the threshold of human comprehension. As Jacob continued his relentless backward walking, the small Polish village of Zawierki found itself at a crossroads between fear, compassion, and superstition. Families that had once considered him a curious child now regarded him with suspicion or outright terror. The dichotomy of reactions reflected not only individual beliefs but also the broader cultural and psychological pressures of an isolated community in the mid-18th century. Some villagers saw Jacob as a fragile victim, a child ensnared by forces beyond his understanding, whether medical, emotional, or supernatural. They attempted to protect him, offering food, shelter, and companionship, attempting to integrate his compulsion into daily life rather than confront it. These households often endured whispered accusations from neighbors, who feared that harboring Jacob might invite misfortune, divine punishment, or the anger of spirits. The social calculus of the village became increasingly complex. Empathy was weighed against collective fear. Morality was challenged by superstition, and the line between careened exposure to danger blurred. Conversely, A growing faction of villagers became convinced that Jacob represented a tangible threat. Elderly farmers, recalling stories passed down from their own parents, feared that his backward walking disrupted the natural order, angering protective spirits and inviting calamity. Reports surfaced of livestock panicking as he passed, fences collapsing inexplicably, and unexplained chills following his path through fields. These incidents reinforced the belief that his compulsion was contagious or cursed, instilling a heightened sense of dread in the community. Neighbors who once observed him at a distance now avoided all interaction, some actively warning their children to stay clear, while others went so far as to threaten him with violence, convinced that intervention was necessary to prevent catastrophe. The tension between compassion and condemnation created a social polarity, leaving Jacob isolated even in the midst of people who knew and loved him. Religious leaders in Zvirki played a pivotal role in shaping perceptions of Jacob. Priests debate whether his condition was a moral failing, a test of faith, or a possession requiring ritual intervention. Parish records from 1748 describe a series of meetings where clergy weighed the merits of confession, prayer, and exorcism. Some argued that Jacob's soul was in peril, that walking backward signified spiritual regression, a literal reversal of the path toward salvation. Others cautioned restraint, asserting that excessive judgment or ritual aggression could worsen his condition or provoke divine disfavor upon the village. These theological debates were not merely academic. They dictated tangible actions, from attempted blessings to the imposition of communal fasting, reinforcing the sense that Jacob's movements were deeply intertwined with cosmic and moral consequences. Eyewitness testimony further illustrates the intensity of communal reaction. Diaries, letters, and parish notes recount villagers' varied experiences. One account describes a woman fainting upon seeing Jacob traverse the town square entirely in reverse, claiming that the air grew colder in his wake. Another records a father insisting that his child must avoid Jacob at all costs, recounting livestock mysteriously dying after proximity to him. At the same time, neighbors sympathetic to Jacob noted the boy's calm demeanor during feast episodes, suggesting that the phenomena observed were as much psychological as physical. Conflict interspiced emerged, with some interpreting natural events, shadows cast by lanterns, the whistling of wind, all of Estoc reacting to human anxiety as supernatural, manifestations directly linked to Jacob. These accounts endures how perception, belief, and expectation shape reality in Zvirki, blending tangible events with interpretive superstition. Social dynamics evolved rapidly as Jacob aged. Families that had initially sought to protect him faced increasing pressure from their peers. Community councils convened to discuss whether Jacob's will be confined, encouraged to undergo spiritual remedies, or even expelled. Yet expulsion was complicated. The boy's family was poor, reliant on communal labor and exchange. Ostracism threatened not only Jacob, but the social fabric supporting his caretakers. In this context, the village navigated a precarious balance: fear-motivated exclusion, empathy-motivated inclusion, and superstition framed every decision as morally significant. The collective psyche of Zvirki became entwined with Jacob's compulsion, as if the boy's backward walking had become a mirror reflecting communal anxieties, social fault lines, and the tension between morality and survival. The psychological impact on villagers was profound. Recurrent encounters with Jacob reportedly induced nausea, vertigo, and acute fear, especially among children. Scholars suggest that witnessing a behavior so anomalous, so entirely outside accepted norm, triggered physiological and cognitive responses akin to trauma. The backward walking became a locus for projection, where villagers' latent anxieties, guilt, and superstitions were externalized onto a tangible figure. Those predisposed to spiritual interpretation saw evidence of sin and possession. Those inclined toward rationalism wrestled with cognitive dissonance, attempting to reconcile observable behavior with known medical or social phenomena. The cumulative effect was a village collectively holding its breath, oscillating between terror and pity, wonder and judgment. Priestly interventions often heightened the drama. Ceremonial exorcisms, blessings, and prayers were attempted repeatedly, sometimes with dramatic public displays. Villagers reported that following these interventions, Jacob's backward walking would intensify temporarily, reinforcing beliefs about spiritual resistance or cosmic disfavor. Some priests concluded that the behavior could only be mitigated through sustained ritual oversight, while others feared that ritual excess might provoke divine wrath. These differing approaches further fragmented the village, creating camps of belief, suspicion, and strategy around a single child whose actions were simultaneously mundane and extraordinary. In addition to formal interventions, folklore circulated rapidly. Stories of other, reversed children, legends of spirits angered by backward movement, and tales of children cursed by divine or demonic force become intertwined with Jacob's daily life. Elders used these tales as cautionary examples, warning youth about consequences of straying from natural and moral order. The oral culture of Zavirki transformed Jacob's actions from personal compulsion into a narrative vehicle for communal values, fears, and superstitions. Over time, these stories solidified into a collective memory, ensuring that Jacob's backward walking resonated beyond direct observation and persisted long after he moved or disappeared. The duality of village reaction, compassion versus fear, highlights the profound social impact of an individual anomaly. Those seeking to protect Jacob provided support networks, ensuring he could survive and maintain some connection to normalcy. Those who ostracized or feared him intensified his isolation, reinforcing the psychological weight of his compulsion. This interplay created a feedback loop where community reaction both responded to and amplified the phenomenon. Every step Jacob took backward elicited ripple effects, whispered conversations, protective gestures, ritual observances, and escalating superstition. His body became a canvas upon which the village projected morality, fear, and hope, creating a living nexus between individual pathology and collective psyche. Ultimately, the story of Jacob and Zavirki illustrates how a single individual's unusual behavior can reverberate through an entire community. By the 1750s, the village was irrevocably shaped by his presence. Families were divided, priests debated theology and morality, and folklore was enriched by daily observation. Observers both contemporaneous and modern recognize that Jacob's backward walking catalyzed reflection on fear, compassion, and the boundaries of normalcy. The tension between innocence and perceived evil, between empathy and dread, defines the village's response. Each narrative diary, letter, or oral account adds a layer of complexity, demonstrating that communal reaction to anomaly is as revealing about the witnesses as it is about the individual at the center. In examining the social, religious, and psychological consequences of Jacob's compulsion, we observe a microcosm of human reaction to the inexplicable. Fear amplified the mystical, compassion mitigated isolation, and superstition shaped morality. The village of Zavirki, in its attempts to understand, control, and respond to Jacob, became a mirror reflecting humanity's struggle with difference, Vunknown, and the boundary between rationality and belief. The boy's backward steps were more than physical. They were a lens through which an entire community confronted its deepest anxieties, hopes, and contradictions. The reactions of Zavirki continue to fascinate historians, psychologists, and folklorists alike. Contemporary editors and scholars find in these accounts a layered narrative, one in which an individual's compulsion enters with communal interpretation, moral philosophy, and superstition. The interplay between observer and observed, belief and reality, innocence and perceived malevolence creates a rich, unresolved tapestry that invites reflection. Jacob's backward walking, therefore, was not merely a phenomenon of movement, but a catalyst for social introspection, revealing the capacity of a community to respond simultaneously with fear, care, and myth-making. Even centuries later, the duality of response protection and fear remains central to understanding the enduring legend of Jacob, while rational explanations illuminate neurological or psychological origins, the social consequences, the folklore, and the collective memory of Zvirky show how human interpretation amplifies and prolongs phenomena beyond their immediate cause. The village's reaction exemplifies the interdependence of individual anomaly and communal narrative, where each backward step reverberates through history, shaping both memory and legend. As Jacob approached adolescence, his backward walking had evolved from a peculiar childhood behavior into an all-consuming compulsion that defined his existence. Observers reported seeing him pacing along the river banks, wandering through the churchyard, and tracing the same paths over and over, always in reverse, always meticulous in the placement of his feet. Even routine tasks fetching water, tending small gardens, or visiting neighbors were performed backward, and his refusal to move forward seemed absolute. Some villagers described a sense of vertigo or nausea when watching him, as if the world itself had shifted subtly in response to his unnatural motion. The physicality of Jacob's behavior, combined with its psychological and social ramifications, created an environment in which speculation and fear intertwined, ensuring that each step backward was observed, remembered, and retold with increasing mythic resonance. Medical scholars who later examined accounts of Jacob's life suggest multiple overlapping explanations. Neurologists posit the possibility of a rare, undiagnosed movement disorder, compounded by obsessive-compulsive tendencies, and the psychological trauma of his early life, including the death of a sibling and the pressures of strict religious upbringing. Some argue that malnutrition and prolonged exposure to harsh environmental conditions could have exacerbated these tendencies, leading to a compulsion that consumed his motor planning and daily routines. Conversion disorder, a condition in which psychological distress manifests in physical symptoms, has also been proposed, with Jacob's community experiences and social isolation providing fertile ground for extreme manifestations. Additionally, some theorists cite ergotism, the ingestion of fungus-contaminated rye, as a potential contributing factor. Historical records indicate that such poisoning could induce hallucinations, paranoia, and repetitive behaviors. These scientific explanations offer plausible, rational accounts for Jacob's behavior, yet they cannot fully capture the extraordinary social and folkloric dimensions of his life, nor do they convincingly account for reports of supernatural phenomena associated with his backward walking. Simultaneously, priests, folklorists, and local chroniclers interpreted Jacob's behavior through a spiritual and mystical lens. Some clergy viewed his backward walking as a literal manifestation of spiritual regression, suggesting that his soul was walking against the ordained path of salvation. Sermons of the era warned congregations that moral corruption or divine punishment could manifest through the anomalous actions of children, and Jacob became an emblem of that belief. Village elders recalled older Slavic tales of reversey children, cursed to walk against the flow of time or whose lives were destined to mirror misfortune and a natural reversal. Such stories provided a cultural framework through which the villagers understood, feared, and narrated Jacob's existence. Priests often attempted ritual interventions, ranging from extended prayers and blessings to exorcisms. Yet these measures were inconsistent in effect and often reinforced the perception that his condition was beyond the reach of ordinary remedies. The final years of Jacob's life were marked by both physical decline and intensification of his compulsion. He rarely left the village boundaries, confined by his own relentless backward walking and by the communal pressure of observation. Witnesses report that he spent long hours at the river's edge, pacing backward along the banks and in the churchyard, tracing repetitive paths around gravestones and shrines. Some scholars have speculated that these behaviors were a form of self-imposed containment, a ritualized mapping of space that both preserved and limited his autonomy. Others propose that he was drawn to liminal spaces, the river, the boundary of the village, the threshold between the sacred and the mundane, because his compulsion had become intertwined with an internalized sense of moral or spiritual innovation. The repetitive, precise movements may have provided psychological structure, a coping mechanism in a world in which he was simultaneously feared, revered, and misunderstood. Accounts of Jacob's death at age 18 vary widely, reinforcing the enigmatic aura surrounding his life. Some contemporaneous reports suggest that malnutrition, prolonged exposure to harsh elements, and physical exhaustion contributed directly to his demise. Witnesses recall seeing him weakened, slowed, yet continuing to walk backward, ignoring both fatigue and hunger. Yet others insisted that his death was supernatural, that a life lived in reverse, a body moving against the natural flow of time and space, could not endure indefinitely in the mortal world. Folkloric retellings suggest that the moment of his death was marked by extraordinary phenomena, a sudden gust of wind, carrying whispers, shadows dancing in unnatural patterns, or ripples across the river that seemed to form letters or symbols. These narratives, though unverifiable, amplified Jacob's legend, embedding him in a tradition of cautionary and mystical tales in Eastern Europe. Theoretical interpretations of Jacob's life continue to inspire debate among scholars, psychologists, and folklorists. Psychiatrists view him as an extreme psychiatric case, a convergence of obsessive-compulsive disorder, trauma, and environmental stressors exacerbated by social isolation. Anthropologists and folklorists highlight the symbolic dimensions, a child enacting societal anxieties about sin, order, and cosmic balance. Historians examine the broader cultural context, noting that 18th-century Polish villages combined strict religiosity, superstition, and limited medical understanding, creating conditions in which unusual behavior could become amplified and mythologized. Each perspective captures a fragment of the truth, but fails to fully reconcile Jacob's neurological, psychological, social, and mystical dimensions. Contemporary comparisons illuminate recurring patterns. Similar tales of reversed children appear in Slavic folklore and across Europe, often associated with curses, ancestral misfortune, or moral transgression. Children will walk backward or act in reversal are described as liminal beings, inhabiting spaces between the ordinary and extraordinary. Psychologists suggest that such folklore may reflect communal mechanisms for interpreting aberrant behavior, projecting collective fears onto individual cases. The enduring fascination with Jacob lies precisely in the tension between these explanations. His backward walking is simultaneously a medical mystery, a symbol of moral and social anxiety, and a source of supernatural speculation. Even centuries later, Jacob's story continues to provoke reflection. The ambiguity surrounding his behavior invites multiple readings, each incomplete yet compelling. Was his backward walking a psychiatric condition exacerbated by trauma and neglect? A mystical affliction imposed by forces beyond comprehension? A symbolic enactment of social, moral, and cosmic anxieties? The village of Zavirki, its observers, priests, and subsequent chroniclers, all contributors of narrative, blending documentation, myth, and interpretation. In this sense, Jacob's life and death cannot be fully disentangled from the community that observed him, the folklore it created, or the scholarly debates it inspires. The legacy of Jacob remains unresolved, a prism through which we examine the interplay of psychology, superstition, morality, and cultural memory. Each theory, scientific, mystical, or symbolic, sheds light on one dimension of his extraordinary life, yet none provides complete resolution. His story illustrates the persistent tension between innocence and perceived evil, between human understanding and the limits of knowledge. Jacob's backward steps, repeated day after day, year after year, created a pattern that was simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary, mundane and terrifying, a behavior rooted in individual compulsion yet magnified into legend by a community, a culture, and history itself. Ultimately, the fascination with Jackie Benders, because he embodies the unresolved, the liminal, and the inexplicable. His life challenges us to consider how communities interpret anomaly, how folklore and superstition shape reality, and how science and psychology struggle to contain behaviors that defy easy categorization. Theories may proliferate, evidence may be reanalyzed, and narratives may shift with each generation, yet the central enigma remains: a boy who walked backward, whose life, death, and meaning continue to provoke awe, fear, and speculation. Jacob's story reminds us that some mysteries resist closure, persisting in memory, scholarship, and legend, compelling reflection on the fragile boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary, between human understanding and the unknowable. Jacob's life and death remain one of the most haunting and perplexing episodes recorded in 18th century Eastern Europe, leaving questions that resist any definitive answer. From the earliest accounts, he emerges as a boy of remarkable sensitivity, empathy, and intelligence, yet simultaneously consumed by a compulsion that set him apart from his peers. His backward walking, first dismissed as childish play, evolved into an all-encompassing behavior that affected every facet of his existence. Villagers reported strange phenomena accompanying his movements, shadows that seemed to follow him, livestock reacting with fear or aggression, and even the unsettling perception that the natural flow of time and space was subtly altered in his presence. Whether these were literal supernatural events, psychological projections, or a combination of both, they shaped the collective anxiousness of Zverki, embedding Jacob's anomaly in both fear and fascination. Medical and psychological interpretations offer compelling, rational frameworks. Scholars suggest that obsessive-compulsive disorder, conversion disorder, or a rare neurological condition could explain his compulsive reversal, exacerbated by trauma, grief, and social isolation. Other theories point to ergot poisoning, malnutrition, or epilepsy as potential contributing factors, situating his behavior within biological and environmental contexts. Yet, these explanations alone fail to account for the extraordinary societal reactions, the folklore that emerged, or the vivid details preserved in diaries and oral histories. In essence, the science provides a partial lens, illuminating aspects of the compulsion while leaving the communal, symbolic, and mystical dimensions census of. Simultaneously, superstition and folklore frame Jacob's backward walking as a cosmic or spiritual phenomenon. Priests interpreted his behavior as divine punishment or a soul walking against the ordained flow of time. Elders referenced centuries-old tales of reversed children, cursed to live in opposition to natural order, creating an overlay of moral and mystical meaning. Communities projected fears, anxieties, and spiritual beliefs onto Jacob, blending observation with imagination. Ritual attempts, prayers, blessings, and exorcisms highlight the tension between human agency and perceived supernatural influence. These interpretations turns an individual's neurological or psychological anomaly into a communal legend, ensuring that each step backward carried weight far beyond the boy himself. The final years of Jacob's life illustrate the intersection of human frailty and societal perception. Confined largely to the boundaries of Zverki, he walked fairy riverbanks and churchyards in meticulous repetition, blending survival with ritual. His death at 18, whether hastened by physical decline, exposure, or some metaphysical consequence, cemented his legend. Theories proliferate: psychiatric, symbolic, folkloric, mystical. Each lens provides insight, yet none resolves the essential enigma. Jacob exists as a nexus of psychology, superstition, and narrative imagination, a figure through which we confront the limits of understanding. Ultimately, Jacob's story challenges the boundary between human comprehension and the inexplicable. It asks us to consider how societal fear, communal superstition, and individual psychology intersect to produce phenomena that defy neat categorization. Was he merely a boy suffering from illness and compulsion, or was there something far stranger at work? The records, oral histories, and folklore offer fragments, leaving the question open, unresolved, and compelling. Jacob walked backward until the end, and in doing so, he left a life and a mystery that endures, haunting generations who encounter it. What do you believe? Was Jacob merely ill or something beyond human understanding?